The morning it happened, Elijah Carter woke before the rooster's cry. The air was thick with the earthy scent of dew, settling on freshly turned soil, and the low hum of crickets still clung to the edges of the night. He stepped onto the worn, wooden porch of his farmhouse, coffee steaming in his hand, and looked out over the endless rows of pecan trees that stretched beyond the mist. For generations, the Carter land had been the first thing you saw when you crested the hill on Route 14, a swath of green and gold that seemed to roll on forever. Anchored by the same red clay his grandfather had first plowed in 1911, it wasn't just property. It was a living story, written in calloused hands and sunburned shoulders. In quiet victories over droughts, and in stubborn refusals to sell when developers waved fat checks in their faces. Elijah's father used to say, "This land's got a heartbeat, boy. You walk it enough, you'll feel it under your feet." Elijah had felt it since he was a child, chasing grasshoppers between furrows, learning the names of trees and where the creek bent just enough to catch catfish in summer. It was where his mother sang while she worked, low-rolling hymns that seemed to sink into the soil itself, and where his father's laughter could still be heard. If you listened close enough on a quiet day, and for 112 years, no Carter had ever let it slip from their hands. That morning, Elijah's boots creaked over the porch boards as he bent to pick up the mail left in the dented metal box at the end of the gravel drive. Mostly bills and advertisements. But in the stack was a thin, cream-colored envelope that bore no return address, only a printed seal with the letters HOA in the middle. His brow furrowed. His family's land wasn't part of any homeowners association. They lived well outside the subdivisions that had sprouted like weeds over the last 2 decades. He tore it open, the paper stiff and dry in his hands. His eyes scanned the letter once, then again, each line making less sense than the last. It read in the cold, mechanical tone of corporate legalese, notice of delinquent assessment recovery and transfer of ownership. It claimed his land, all 1,500 acres, had been sold to recover unpaid HOA dues. The total they claimed he owed, $742.63. Elijah's lips parted in disbelief, and then a bitter, incredulous laugh escaped him. It was absurd. He'd never signed a contract, never agreed to join any HOA, never owed them a single cent. But the next paragraph was the gut punch. It stated the sale had already been processed, filed with the county clerk, and transferred to the management group that oversaw the HOA. His land, his family's birthright, was now, on paper, theirs. For a long moment, Elijah stood, frozen at the edge of his porch, the letter trembling in his hand. The fields stretched out before him like they always had, golden light beginning to pour over the horizon. But suddenly, it all looked different, like it wasn't his anymore, like he was standing on someone else's ground. Memories started to creep in, his grandfather's voice telling him about the old days, when men in suits came down from the city with clipboards and contracts, promising improvements in exchange for a signature. They called it progress back then. Elijah called it theft. He thought about his father, who had passed only 3 years earlier, his hands clasped around Elijah's in the hospital bed, saying, "Don't let them take it, son, not a single inch." By the time the sun had fully risen, the hum of an engine echoed across the property. Elijah looked up to see a white pickup truck kicking up dust along the east fence line. 2 men got out, one in a collared shirt and khakis, the other in a bright safety vest. Clipboards in hand, they began pacing the edge of the property, pointing toward the pecan trees like they were planning where to put a parking lot. Elijah's blood began to boil. He strode down from the porch, each step quick and heavy. "Hey," he barked across the field. The men turned, startled, but one recovered quickly, offering a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter," the man in khakis called back. "That's right. I'm with the Fairview Estates Homeowners Association. We're here to conduct an initial survey for the new community development project." Elijah blinked slowly, his voice steady but edged with steel. "This isn't Fairview Estates. This is my land." The man didn't flinch. "Sir, according to our records, the property is now under the HOA's jurisdiction. You'll need to vacate by the end of next month." The words hung in the air like poison. Vacate, as if he was a trespasser on his own soil. That night, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with nothing but a pot of black coffee and a yellow legal pad. The only light came from a single bulb above the table, casting deep shadows over the wood grain. He began scribbling names, dates, references to property records he'd seen years ago. He wasn't a lawyer, but his father had taught him to read contracts like scripture, line by line. 2 days later, he drove into town to the county records office. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, pulled the file for him without question. Inside were copies of deeds, tax receipts, and, to his disgust, the very transfer document the HOA had filed. The signature line for Elijah Carter had been filled in, but it wasn't his handwriting. The notary stamp was real. That was the part that chilled him. Someone had managed to make a forgery look official enough to pass legal review. The deeper he dug, the more rot he uncovered. The HOA's management group had been acquiring properties for years under similar circumstances: bogus liens, surprise assessments, and forged agreements. Most owners, unable to fight the legal machine, walked away in defeat. But Elijah wasn't most owners. He wasn't going to walk away. He began assembling a file of his own, photos of his grandfather on the land, handwritten letters from his father discussing their ownership, and every legal receipt proving the Carters had paid their taxes in full. He made copies of every document from the records office, highlighting inconsistencies in the HOA's filings. In the evenings, he'd drive past the homes inside Fairview Estates, rows of two-story houses with manicured lawns and SUVs in the driveways. Inside those walls lived the people whose HOA board had stolen from him. They probably thought they were untouchable. But Elijah was learning the rules of their game, and he was already planning how to beat them at it. It wasn't just about getting the land back anymore. No, that would be too easy. Elijah wanted them to feel the sting of loss, to watch their sense of security crumble, to see the look in their eyes when they realized their own homes were on the auction block, all by the letter of the law. And for that, he would need patience. Patience, and a strategy so airtight it would make their own lawyers choke. The courthouse steps in downtown Fairview had been polished smooth by a century of feet. Lawyers, criminals, and ordinary folks seeking justice. Elijah climbed them slow that morning, a man walking into enemy territory. He wore his best shirt, the white one with crisp sleeves his mother had pressed before church on Sundays, and carried a thick leather folder under his arm. To anyone passing, he looked like a man with business to handle. They couldn't see the storm in his chest. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The echo of footsteps bounced off marble walls as Elijah approached the records division. He'd been here once before, back when his father was alive, to look up their original family deed. Now, he was looking for something much darker. The clerk recognized him from the week prior and gave a quiet nod. "You back for more records, Mr. Carter?" "Yeah," Elijah replied, his voice even. "Everything you've got on Fairview Estates, HOA, I mean everything. Incorporation papers, amendments, lawsuits, lien records, board member names. If it's got their stamp on it, I want to see it." She hesitated, glancing at the growing line behind him, but then disappeared into the back room. 10 minutes later, she returned with a wheeled cart stacked high with boxers. Elijah thanked her, carried the first one to a corner table, and began the long, grueling work of learning his enemy. He read for hours, tracing patterns most people would have missed. The HOA had been incorporated 27 years ago by a development firm that no longer existed, dissolved quietly, its assets sold to another entity with almost the same name. That second company was run by 3 people: Gregory Hayes, an ex-real estate lawyer, Mark Branson, a former banker, and Sandra Lowell, a woman who had served as HOA president for nearly 2 decades. They'd expanded the HOA's reach far beyond its original boundaries, absorbing smaller associations, sometimes through voluntary votes, sometimes through administrative mergers that skirted legal lines. The more Elijah read, the more a cold realization set in. This wasn't sloppy greed. This was precision theft. One file contained meeting minutes from 5 years ago, where the board openly discussed targeting underutilized parcels for acquisition. The language was sanitized, but Elijah could read between the lines. They meant land like his, land without modern development, often owned by older families who might not fight back in the middle of a stack of lien notices. Elijah found something that made him sit back in his chair. It was a property seizure from 2 years ago involving a man named Henry Douglas. Henry had fought in court for 9 months before losing not just his house, but the 5 acres it sat on. The sale had been conducted through a judicial foreclosure, but the amount owed was laughable, less than $1,200 in HOA fines. The house had been resold to a private buyer, who just happened to be Mark Branson's brother-in-law. Elijah closed the file slowly, his pulse steadying into something dangerous. They'd built an entire system where theft was legal, or at least legal enough to survive a challenge. If he was going to beat them, he couldn't just fight for his land. He'd have to dismantle their system piece by piece. He began by mapping out every property the HOA had seized in the last 15 years. Names of owners, dates of seizure, sale prices, buyers. Patterns emerged. Certain buyers appeared again and again, always connected by blood or business to the board members. That night, Elijah sat at his kitchen table again, the same single bulb overhead. He spread the papers out like a battlefield. His plan began to take shape, slow and deliberate. He wasn't going to come at them head on. That's what they expected. Instead, he'd become part of their world. He'd play their game from the inside, using their own rules against them. Step 1 was simple. He needed allies. And not just any allies. People who had already been burned by the HOA. People with grudges deep enough to stick through a long fight. He found his first in Henry Douglas, now living in a small rental on the edge of town. Henry answered the door with suspicion, but when Elijah explained what had happened to his land, the older man's eyes lit with the kind of fury that only comes from loss. "You think you can take them down?" Henry asked, leaning on the doorframe. "I don't think," Elijah said. "I know, but I can't do it alone." By the end of that week, Elijah had met with 5 other former owners. All had similar stories: forged signatures, surprise assessments, impossible deadlines. Each of them agreed to share documents, testify if necessary, and help Elijah build his case. But Elijah wasn't just building a case for court. He was building something bigger, a way to turn the HOA's own financial machinery against them. He learned that many of their board members' homes were held in trusts or LLCs, shielded from easy seizure. But some weren't, and under state law, a properly filed lien could lead to foreclosure if unpaid. The irony wasn't lost on him. They had taken his land with a lien. He intended to take theirs the same way. He knew it wouldn't be quick. Every move had to be legal, documented, airtight. So while the HOA continued clearing trees on his stolen property, Elijah was quietly buying up small debts connected to the board members' homes, unpaid contractor bills, old tax penalties, even delinquent utility accounts. The amounts were small, almost laughable. But in the world of property law, a lien was a lien, no matter how small the debt. At the same time, Elijah filed a civil suit against the HOA for fraud, attaching every forged document and false claim he'd uncovered. The suit alone wouldn't win back his land overnight, but it would put pressure on them, force them to spend money defending themselves. Money they'd soon need for another problem. The liens Elijah was quietly stacking against their own houses. Weeks turned into months. By spring, Elijah had assembled a web of filings so complex it would take the HOA's lawyers weeks just to untangle it. And when they finally understood what was happening, it would already be too late. Because Elijah wasn't just fighting to get back what was his. He was fighting to show them that a man who knows the land and the law is not someone you can push off his porch with a letter and a fake signature. He was going to make them watch as the ground disappeared from under their own feet. By the time summer heat rolled in, the quiet war Elijah had been waging was no longer invisible. Inside the glass front HOA offices on Main Street, the board was holding emergency meetings twice a week, trying to figure out how one man had backed them into a corner. They had always seen themselves as the hunters, swooping in with liens and threats, taking what they wanted without resistance. But Elijah's filings had turned them into prey. It started with a single envelope that landed on Gregory Hayes' doorstep, a lien notice for $342 in unpaid contractor fees tied to his sprawling two-story home. Gregory, a man who prided himself on keeping every bill current, called it a clerical mistake and tossed it aside. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived, at this one for $189 in unpaid county inspection fees. Both liens were now legally recorded against his property, and under the same foreclosure statutes the HOA had used for years. Those liens could be enforced if left unpaid. Mark Branson got his own surprise when a letter from the county tax office informed him that an old landscaping bill from 4 years ago had been purchased by a third-party debt collector, Elijah. It was legal, untraceable, back to malice, and exactly the kind of pressure Elijah wanted to apply. Sandra Lowell, the longest-serving board member, found herself in a similar bind. A minor but valid debt tied to her vacation cabin had quietly changed hands. She didn't know that the man who now owned the debt was the same man she had ordered off his land with a smug smile months earlier. Elijah didn't revel in their panic. Not yet. He worked methodically, keeping every filing within the letter of the law, every debt properly documented. He knew that if they caught even a whiff of illegality on his part, they'd weaponize it against him. This wasn't about revenge. For revenge's sake, it was about justice with surgical precision. Meanwhile, his civil lawsuit against the HOA was gathering momentum. His attorney, a sharp, fast-talking woman named Carla Reeves, had taken the case not just because she believed in it, but because she'd seen what the HOA had done to her own uncle's property years earlier. She was relentless, filing motion after motion, forcing the HOA to produce thousands of pages of records. In one of those records, dumps, Elijah found the crack he'd been waiting for, an internal email chain between board members discussing expedited seizures of properties they believed were underutilized. One line, written by Gregory himself, made Elijah's jaw tighten. If the owners won't sell, find a way to bill them into foreclosure. That single sentence was the smoking gun proof that their actions weren't just overreach, but premeditated theft. Carla filed it as Exhibit A in the lawsuit. By August, the local paper had caught wind of the case. An article appeared with the headline, "Farmer Takes HOA to Court Over 1,500 Acres." The story painted Elijah as a stubborn, principled man, fighting a Goliath of bureaucracy. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years stopped him at the feed store to offer encouragement. Some even shared their own run-ins with the HOA, giving Elijah more ammunition. The pressure began to tell. At a tense HOA board meeting, one humid Thursday evening, Gregory slammed his fist on the table. "We've got to settle this before it gets worse," he growled. "The man's got half the town on his side, and the paper's making us look like crooks." Sandra shot back. "That's because we are starting to look like crooks. Greg, if this goes to trial, we'll lose everything." Mark, pale and sweating, muttered, "He's got liens on my house." "My house, Greg. Do you understand what that means?" But Elijah wasn't ready to talk settlement. He knew the deeper their fear ran, the more leverage he'd have. He let Carla handle the formal communications. Always polite, always firm. Our client is prepared to discuss resolution once full restitution of the property is guaranteed, along with damages. Privately, Elijah had a different endgame. Restitution was only the first step. He wanted the HOA dissolved, its power dismantled so it could never pull the same scheme on anyone else. And he was getting closer by the day. Then came the day everything shifted. Elijah was sitting on his porch, a stack of court papers beside him, when a county sheriff's cruiser pulled into the drive. For a split second, his stomach tightened. Old memories of lawmen arriving with bad news. But the deputy who stepped out wasn't there to threaten him. He was there to deliver 3 certified notices. Foreclosure proceedings had officially been initiated against the homes of Gregory Hayes, Mark Branson, and Sandra Lowell. Elijah stared at the envelopes, a slow, grim smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It was poetic. The same legal weapon they had used to strip him of his land was now pointed squarely at their own front doors. The next HOA meeting was chaos. Homeowners packed the small community hall, demanding answers from the visibly shaken board. Voices rose, accusations flew, and for the first time, Elijah walked into one of their meetings, not as a target, but as a man holding the high ground. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply handed each board member a copy of the foreclosure notices, along with a printed excerpt from Gregory's damning email. "You took my land," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying over the noise. "Now the law is taking yours. Fair is fair." The room fell into stunned silence. And just like that, the tide had turned. The trial began on a Monday morning in late October, the kind of crisp autumn day where the air feels sharper than usual, as if the world itself is holding its breath. Elijah walked up the courthouse steps in a dark suit that fit him like it had been tailored for this very moment. He wasn't a man who wore suits often. The land had been his uniform for most of his life, but today called for armor, and he wore it well. His leather folder was heavier now, not just with documents, but with the weight of 3 generations behind him. Inside, the courtroom was already buzzing. On one side sat the HOA board, their lawyers stacked with binders, whispering frantically. Gregory Hayes looked haggard, Mark Branson avoided eye contact, and Sandra Lowell sat stiff as a statue, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. On the other side sat Elijah, calm but watchful, with Carla Reeves beside him, her black blazer sharp, her eyes sharper. Judge Marion Whitfield presided over the bench, a woman known for her intolerance of games in her courtroom. As she called the case, the gallery leaned forward. The local press was there in force. Reporters, scribbling in notepads, cameras clicking softly. This was no longer just a property dispute. It had become a public reckoning. The HOA's attorneys opened with polished speeches about misunderstandings and clerical oversights, painting the seizure of Elijah's land as an unfortunate error caused by overlapping property lines and outdated records. They downplayed the forged signature, calling it a possible mix-up. Elijah listened without blinking. When it was Carla's turn, she didn't waste a second. "Your Honor, this is not a clerical error. This is not a misunderstanding. This is theft, calculated, intentional, and repeated over years against dozens of property owners in this county." She began laying out evidence like stones in a path: the forged documents, the internal emails, the pattern of acquisitions, the resale of properties to relatives and business partners. Exhibit after exhibit was displayed on a large screen, each one tightening the noose. And then came Gregory's damning line, in his own words: "If the owners won't sell, find a way to bill them into foreclosure." The courtroom murmured. Judge Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Hayes, do you deny writing this?" Gregory's mouth opened, then closed. I don't recall. That's your email address." Carla cut in smoothly. "Your timestamp, your board meeting minutes." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, there is no clearer proof of intent. For 3 days, witness after witness testified. Henry Douglas, the other displaced owners, even a former HOA employee who admitted under oath that he'd been instructed to file liens on properties without verifying debts. Each story painted the same picture: an organization drunk on power, using the law as a weapon. On the final day, Elijah took the stand. His voice was steady, his words plain. "This land wasn't just dirt to me. It was where my grandfather planted the first pecan tree, where my father taught me to read the sky for rain, where my mother sang while she worked. They didn't just take acres, they took history, they took roots, and they thought no one would fight back. But I did." The silence in the courtroom was heavy, almost reverent. Carla nodded, satisfied, and rested her case. When Judge Whitfield returned after deliberation, the entire room tensed. "In the matter of Carter versus Fairview, a state's homeowners association," she began, her voice clear and final. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff." Elijah exhaled slowly, but the judge wasn't done. "The court orders the immediate return of the 1,500 acres to Mr. Carter, nullifies the fraudulent transfer, awards compensatory damages of $2.8 million, and refers this matter to the district attorney for criminal investigation." She glanced toward the HOA table. "Furthermore, the court orders the dissolution of the Fairview Estates, HOA, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the room. The board members sat frozen, their Empire collapsing in real time. Outside, cameras swarmed Elijah as he descended the courthouse steps. He spoke briefly, his voice calm but resolute. This wasn't just about me. It was about every person who's been told they can't fight back. Now they know they can. The months that followed brought a strange symmetry. Gregory Hayes' home went up for auction to satisfy the liens. So did Mark Branson's and Sandra Lowell's. Elijah bought them all legally, in full compliance with the very system they had once abused. Not to live in them, but to sell them to people the board had once bullied, at prices they could actually afford. One winter morning, standing in the middle of his reclaimed land, Elijah watched the sun rise over the pecan trees. The fields were quiet, the frost glistening like silver. He felt no gloating satisfaction, only a deep, steady peace. The fight had been long, but it had been worth every step, and as the first light broke fully over the horizon, Elijah thought of his father's words. Don't let them take it, son. Not a single inch. They hadn't. The night before the verdict, Elijah sat alone on the creaking porch of his grandfather's old farmhouse, the same porch where stories of the land had been told for generations. The sky was deep and endless, littered with stars that seemed older than time itself. A warm breeze carried the scent of pine and tilled soil, a reminder of everything that was at stake. The trial had been brutal weeks of cross-examinations, lies, and paperwork stacked higher than any barn he had ever built. But tomorrow, the decision would come. His lawyer, Charles Daner, an old warhorse of the courtroom with silver hair, and a voice like a freight train, had told him they had the truth on their side. But truth didn't always win. Elijah knew that. He'd seen neighbors lose land to smooth-talking developers before. He'd seen families uprooted because some clerk signed the wrong paper. But this wasn't just about acres on a map. This was about his blood, his father's sweat, his mother's prayers, and the promise he'd made over a fresh grave that he would never let this land slip away. The crickets sang low, and in the distance a lone coyote cried, as if it too knew a storm was about to pass through. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He walked the rows of pecan trees, dragging his fingers along the rough bark, feeling the history etched into every groove. He touched the soil, remembering the years he'd spent mending it after droughts, floods, and neglect. At dawn, the horizon blushed pink and gold, and Elijah put on his best suit, a charcoal one that still smelled faintly of cedar from his grandmother's chest. His hands were steady, but his chest felt tight as he drove into town. The courthouse loomed like a stone sentinel, its columns tall and stern. The HOA members were already there, clustered together in polished suits and pearl necklaces, whispering in a circle like they could still change fate by gossip alone. Elijah ignored them. He found a seat near the front beside Charles, who gave him a firm nod that said, "Hold steady." The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Elijah searched for some sign of smile, a glance, but they gave nothing away. The four-person stood, a paper trembling in their hand. For a moment, Elijah heard nothing but the rush of his own heartbeat, drowning out the judge's voice, the shuffling of papers, the creak of chairs. Then the words broke through. "We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, Elijah Booker." The rest came in a blur: compensation for damages, the return of all 1,500 acres, and, in a twist that left the HOA gasping, authorization to seize and liquidate assets to satisfy punitive damages. Elijah blinked, unable to breathe, as if the air had been sucked from the room. The HOA president's face went pale, her lips parting in shock. One man in the back muttered a curse under his breath. Charles grinned and clapped Elijah on the back so hard it rattled his bones. Reporters swarmed the aisle as the gavel struck, but Elijah slipped out the side door. The air outside was sharp with autumn, the sky wide and clean. Over the next weeks, the ruling rippled through the town like a stone dropped in still water. The HOA's grand homes, with their manicured lawns and imported fountains, went up for auction one by one. Elijah didn't watch the auctions. He didn't need to. He was back on his porch, watching the sunrise, knowing the land was his again. But word traveled fast. People said he bought 3 of the HOA houses himself, not to live in, but to donate. 2 struggling families who'd been pushed out of the neighborhood by the same people who'd tried to ruin him. Some said it was revenge. Elijah called it balance. One evening, he walked to the highest hill on his property. From there, you could see everything: the pecan groves, the wide fields, the ribbon of creek that caught the light like silver. The wind moved through the grass like a whispered hymn. Elijah closed his eyes, hearing his father's voice in the rustle of leaves, his mother's laughter in the creak of the porch boards back home. This was the land they had fought for, the land they had bled for, and now it was safe. The town had changed, too. Folks who once crossed the street to avoid him now stopped to shake his hand. The sheriff, who had been quiet during the trial, made a point to nod at him when their paths crossed. Even some of the displaced HOA members, stripped of their titles and gated drives, found new humility in smaller homes, working side by side with the very people they once looked down upon. Elijah didn't hate them. Hate was heavy, and he had carried enough weight in his life. What he carried now was lighter pride, peace, and the knowledge that justice, though slow, had found its way home. On a cold winter morning months later, Elijah stood at the edge of his field as snow began to fall, soft and quiet. He reached down, scooped a handful, and let it melt in his palm. It felt clean, new. He smiled, not for the victory, but for the journey it had taken to get there. The land stretched out before him, endless and eternal, just as it had been for generations, and as it would be for the ones yet to come.